civilizations that knew about past catastrophes. The stone tablet had survived for 4,000 years. Carved in the wedge-shaped script of ancient Sumer, it told of a time when the gods had grown weary of humanity's noise and decided to cleanse the earth with water. The hero Zusudra, warned by the god Enki, built a great boat and saved the seed of mankind. When British archaeologist George Smith first translated this text in 1872, he became so overwhelmed that he began removing his clothes in excitement right there in the British Museum. He had discovered that the biblical flood story was far older than anyone had imagined, preserved in clay for millennia, by a civilization that had experienced something so catastrophic that they felt compelled to warn all future generations. This was not myth. This was memory. Throughout human history, civilizations have encoded their knowledge of past disasters into their cultures, their religions, their very architecture. They built monuments designed to last 10,000 years. They carved warnings into stone. They created rituals that would preserve crucial information, even if their languages were forgotten. They understood something that modern humanity often forgets. Catastrophe is not an anomaly, but a recurring feature of existence on this planet. The Sumerians, who lived in the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers around 3000 BCE, were among the first to commit their catastrophe knowledge to permanent record. Their flood narrative, which predates the biblical account by at least 1,000 years, appears in multiple versions across Mesopotamian literature. The most complete version, found in the Epic of Gilgamesh, tells of Utnapishtim, who was warned by the god Ea that the gods had decreed the destruction of all life. Utnapishtim built a cube-shaped boat, waterproofed it with bitumen, and loaded it with his family, craftsmen, and animals of every kind. The rains came for 6 days and 7 nights. The storm was so terrible that even the gods were frightened, cowering like dogs against the walls of heaven. When the waters finally receded, Utnapishtim's boat came to rest on Mount Nisir, in what is now the Kurdistan region of Iraq. He released a dove, which returned finding no resting place. He released a swallow, which also returned. Finally, he released a raven, which did not return, indicating that dry land had appeared. What makes this story remarkable is not its similarity to the biblical account, but its geological plausibility. In 1929, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley was excavating the ancient city of Ur, birthplace of Abraham according to biblical tradition, when his workers struck a layer of clean water-deposited silt nearly 10 feet thick. Below this sterile layer, they found earlier human habitation. Woolley had discovered evidence of a massive flood that had covered an area of roughly 40,000 square miles, the entire known world for the people living there at the time. The Sumerians did not simply remember this catastrophe. They institutionalized it. Their king lists, carved in stone and preserved across multiple copies, divide all of history into 2 eras, before the flood and after the flood. The kings who ruled before the flood were said to have reigned for impossibly long periods, tens of thousands of years each. After the flood, the reigns became shorter, more human. Some scholars interpret this as a metaphor for the loss of knowledge, the breaking of continuity, the sense that something precious had been destroyed and could never be fully recovered. But the Sumerians were not content merely to remember. They also tried to prepare. Their temple complexes, built on elevated platforms called ziggurats, were explicitly designed to survive flooding. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, which still stands today as a crumbling monument in southern Iraq, rises in 3 stages to a height of nearly 100 feet. Its core was built of mud brick, but its outer shell was made of fired brick, set in bitumen mortar, the same waterproofing material that Utnapishtim supposedly used for his ark. These structures were not simply religious monuments. They were survival platforms, places where the community could gather above the waters when the rivers inevitably rose again. The Mesopotamians also developed sophisticated early warning systems. They monitored the levels of the Tigris and Euphrates obsessively, carving records into stone and maintaining generations of hydrological data. They knew that certain astronomical configurations correlated with flood years. They understood that the spring melt in the mountains of Armenia could arrive as a devastating wall of water weeks later. This knowledge was considered so sacred that it was entrusted to the priesthood, who maintained it as a religious duty. Across the ancient world, other civilizations were doing the same thing, encoding their catastrophe knowledge into forms designed to survive the death of their cultures. In Egypt, the priests of Heliopolis maintained records of every Nile flood for more than 3,000 years. They understood the critical importance of the annual inundation, which deposited the fertile silt that made agriculture possible. But they also remembered the years when the flood failed entirely, bringing famine and social collapse, and the years when the flood came too strong. The Egyptian hieroglyph for year was a young plant springing from the inundation. Their entire calendar was organized around the flood cycle, but their monuments tell a darker story as well. In the Temple of Karnak, inscriptions from the reign of Ramesses II describe a devastating drought that lasted for years, during which the Nile failed to rise and the people starved. Similar records from the reign of Pharaoh Jer, who ruled around 3000 BCE, describe plagues of locusts that devoured the crops after the floodwaters receded too quickly. The Egyptians responded to these memories by building one of the most resilient civilizations in human history. Their granaries were designed to store 7 years of surplus, a practice that Genesis attributes to the wisdom of Joseph. Their irrigation systems were engineered to capture and store floodwaters for use during drought years. Their monuments, built of stone rather than mud brick, were designed to last forever, ensuring that the knowledge they contained would survive any catastrophe short of the end of the world itself. The Greeks inherited much of this catastrophe knowledge from Egypt. The philosopher Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, records a conversation between the Athenian statesman Solon and an Egyptian priest that took place 2 centuries earlier. The priest gently mocked the Greeks for their cultural amnesia. "You Greeks are always children," he said. "You have no ancient knowledge, no learning grey with age. The reason is this: there have been, and will be, many destructions of mankind, the greatest by fire and water, though lesser ones come from countless other causes." The priest then described a cycle of catastrophes that periodically wiped out human civilization. The Greeks, he explained, had lost their history multiple times, destroyed by floods and earthquakes and conflagrations. Each time the survivors had to rebuild from scratch, losing all the accumulated knowledge of their predecessors. Only Egypt, protected by its geography and its priestly traditions, had maintained continuous records across these catastrophic boundaries. This conversation, recorded in Plato's dialogues Timaeus and Critias, also contains the famous account of Atlantis, a great civilization destroyed in a single day and night of earthquakes and floods. Modern scholars debate whether Atlantis was a real place or a philosophical allegory, but the Egyptian priest's broader point is archaeologically supported. The Mediterranean world has indeed been devastated by repeated catastrophes, and civilizations have indeed risen and fallen as a result. The eruption of Thera, the volcanic island now called Santorini around 1628 BCE, was one of the most powerful volcanic events in recorded history. The explosion blew the center out of the island, triggering tsunamis that may have reached 150 feet in height as they crashed into the northern coast of Crete, just 70 miles to the south. The Minoan civilization, one of the most advanced cultures of the ancient world, was devastated. Their palace complexes were destroyed. Their fleet was annihilated. Within a few generations, the Minoans had vanished from history, absorbed by the mainland Greeks who called themselves Mycenaeans. But the memory of their destruction survived. The Greeks preserved stories of islands that sank beneath the waves, of cities destroyed by the anger of Poseidon, the earth-shaker god of the sea. The story of Atlantis itself may be a distorted memory of the Minoan collapse, filtered through Egyptian records and Greek mythology until the original event was no longer recognizable. The volcanic destruction of Thera also likely contributed to the legend of the Titanomachy, the war between the Olympian gods and the Titans, which Greek tradition placed in roughly the same era and which is described in terms that sound remarkably like a volcanic eruption. Fire from the sky, the earth shaking, smoke and ash blocking out the sun. The Mycenaean Greeks who succeeded the Minoans also met a catastrophic end. Around 1200 BCE, their civilization collapsed in a conflagration that also destroyed the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the Egyptian New Kingdom, and the trading cities of the Levantine coast. This event, known to archaeologists as the Bronze Age collapse, was one of the worst catastrophes in human history, setting back Mediterranean civilization by several centuries. The causes of the Bronze Age collapse are still debated. Some scholars blame invasions by mysterious sea peoples, who appear in Egyptian records. Others point to prolonged drought, revealed by analysis of pollen cores and tree rings, which would have caused agricultural failure and famine across the entire region. Still others suggest that the complex trading networks of the Bronze Age had become so interdependent that the failure of any single node could cascade across the entire system, like a financial crisis spreading from country to country. Whatever the cause, the survivors remembered. The Greeks of the classical period, who lived 5 centuries after the collapse, told stories of a heroic age when men were stronger and gods walked among mortals. The poems of Homer, composed around 750 BCE but describing events set 400 years earlier, preserve garbled memories of the Mycenaean world, its great palaces, its bronze-armoured warriors, its complex bureaucracy. The story of the Trojan War itself may be a telescoped account of the Bronze Age collapse, a single dramatic narrative that compresses decades of warfare and migration into the 10-year siege of a single city. The Greeks also remembered through their religious practices. Every year the Athenians celebrated the festival of the Anthesteseria, during which they believed that the souls of the dead rose from the underworld and walked among the living. During this festival, it was forbidden to enter the temples or conduct normal business. The living were supposed to placate the dead with offerings of food and drink, then send them back to the underworld, with the formula, "Out, you spirits! The Anthesteria is over." Modern scholars interpret the Anthesteria as a ritual remembrance of mass death, possibly from plague or famine, encoded into religious practice so that it would never be forgotten. The Greeks were not simply commemorating their ancestors, they were reenacting a catastrophe, keeping the memory alive so that future generations would understand what their civilization had survived. Similar practices existed across the ancient world. The Hebrew tradition of Passover commemorates the exodus from Egypt, but its ritual elements suggest even older catastrophe memories. The unleavened bread recalls a hasty departure, a flight from danger with no time for normal preparations. The bitter herbs represent suffering. The blood on the doorposts, originally painted to protect Hebrew homes from the angel of death, may derive from older apotropaic practices designed to ward off plague or pestilence. The Hebrew prophets were obsessed with catastrophe. Their writings are filled with warnings of impending disaster, earthquakes, floods, famines, plagues, foreign invasions. Some of these warnings were specific predictions that came true. The prophet Amos, writing in the 8th century BCE, warned that the northern kingdom of Israel would be destroyed by Assyria. This happened within a generation of his death. Other warnings were more general but equally accurate. The prophets understood that complex civilizations are fragile, that moral decay leads to social collapse, that the wealthy who ignore the poor are building their own destruction. The destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586 BCE became the central catastrophe of Jewish consciousness. The Temple of Solomon was burned. The population was deported to Babylon. The kingdom that had existed for 4 centuries was annihilated, yet the Jewish people survived, precisely because they had encoded their identity into portable forms, books and practices rather than temples and territories that could withstand any catastrophe short of complete. The books of Lamentations and the Psalms preserve the raw grief of this catastrophe. By the rivers of Babylon there we sat down, yea, we wept, when we remembered Zion. But they also preserve the determination to remember. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. The Jews who returned from Babylon to rebuild the temple made the recording and preservation of their history a sacred obligation. They created a tradition of scrupulous textual transmission that has preserved their scriptures across 2,500 years, surviving the destruction of the Second Temple, the Roman dispersal, medieval persecution, and the Holocaust itself. On the other side of the world, another civilization was encoding its catastrophe knowledge into equally durable forms. The ancient Chinese were obsessive record keepers, maintaining continuous historical archives that stretch back more than 3,000 years. These records document a parade of natural disasters, floods, droughts, earthquakes, famines, plagues. They also document human responses to these disasters, including both successful mitigations and catastrophic failures. The legendary Emperor Yu, who supposedly founded the Xia dynasty around 2070 BCE, earned his throne by successfully controlling a great flood that had devastated China for generations. According to tradition, Yu worked for 13 years to tame the waters, passing by his own home 3 times without entering because his task was too important to allow for personal considerations. He dredged rivers, built canals, and drained swamps, transforming a flooded wasteland into productive farmland. When the flood was finally controlled, the grateful people made him their ruler. Archaeological evidence suggests that this story, like the Mesopotamian flood narratives, has a historical core. Around 1920 BCE, an earthquake triggered a massive landslide that blocked the Yellow River in what is now Qinghai Province. The resulting dam held back water for several months before catastrophically failing, releasing a flood that geologists estimate reached 500 feet in height at the dam site and 130 feet in height 25 kilometers downstream. This was one of the largest floods in Earth's history, and it would have devastated the proto-Chinese settlements in the lower Yellow River Valley. The Chinese response to their flood memories was systematic engineering. Over the following millennia, they built the most extensive system of flood control works in the ancient world: levees, dams, canals, reservoirs, and drainage ditches that tamed the unpredictable Yellow River and made intensive agriculture possible in its floodplain. This work required massive coordination of labor and resources, which in turn required a powerful central government. Some historians argue that Chinese civilization itself, with its strong state and its tradition of bureaucratic administration, was shaped by the need to manage flood control at a scale that required collective action across entire regions. The Chinese also maintained detailed records of earthquakes, which they experienced with devastating frequency. The earthquake that struck Shaanxi province in 1556 killed an estimated 830,000 people, making it the deadliest earthquake in recorded history. But this was only the worst of many. Chinese historical records document thousands of major earthquakes over the past 3 millennia, along with observations about precursor phenomena such as changes in well water levels, unusual animal behavior, and atmospheric disturbances. These observations led to the development of the world's first seismograph, invented by the polymath Zhang Heng in 1932 CE. Zhang's device was a bronze vessel with dragon heads arranged around its rim, each holding a bronze ball in its mouth. When an earthquake occurred, even at great distance, the motion would trigger an internal mechanism that would cause one of the dragons to drop its ball into the mouth of a bronze toad positioned below, indicating the direction of the earthquake. On one occasion, the device reportedly detected an earthquake that had occurred 500 kilometers away in a region from which no human messenger had yet arrived. The Indians developed their own sophisticated understanding of catastrophe. The concept of the Yuga, a cosmic age lasting millions of years, reflects a worldview in which catastrophe is built into the fabric of time itself. According to Hindu cosmology, we are currently living in the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness and strife, which will end in universal destruction before the cycle begins again. This is not a single catastrophe, but an endless series of catastrophes, separated by periods of relative peace and prosperity, stretching backward and forward through infinite time. This cosmology might seem like mere mythology, but it encodes a profound understanding of deep time that Western science did not achieve until the 19th century. The Indians understood that the Earth was immensely old, that civilizations had risen and fallen countless times before the present era, that the human lifespan was a brief flicker against the vast backdrop of cosmic history. This understanding bred both fatalism and resilience. Fatalism because individual efforts could not prevent the eventual destruction of everything, resilience because destruction was always followed by renewal. The Indian tradition also preserved specific catastrophe memories. The Mahabharata, one of the longest epic poems in any language, describes a devastating war that may reflect a real conflict from the second millennium BCE. The weapons used in this war are described in terms that have struck some modern readers as uncannily similar to nuclear weapons. A single projectile, charged with all the power of the universe, a blast that produced an incandescent column of smoke and flame as bright as 10,000 suns, victims whose hair and nails fell out, food that became poisoned. Most scholars interpret these descriptions as poetic exaggeration or later interpolation, but they reflect a genuine understanding that human conflict could reach civilization-ending intensity. The Mahabharata is fundamentally a tragedy, a story about how even the most righteous war leads to catastrophic destruction. Its heroes achieve victory, but lose everything in the process. The poem ends with the survivors walking through fields of the dead, surveying the ruins of the civilization they had fought to preserve. Across the Pacific, the civilizations of Mesoamerica developed their own catastrophe consciousness. The Maya, whose civilization flourished from roughly 2000 BCE to 1500 CE in what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, were obsessed with time and its cycles. Their calendar systems, which included a 260-day sacred calendar, a 365-day solar calendar, and a long count that tracked days from a creation date in 3114 BCE, were designed to identify patterns in cosmic history that would reveal when catastrophes were likely to occur. The Maya believed that the current world was the fourth creation, preceded by 3 earlier worlds that had been destroyed by the gods. The first world, populated by mud people, dissolved in water because its inhabitants could not properly worship the gods. The second world, populated by wooden people, was destroyed by flood and demon attacks. The third world, populated by monkeys, was destroyed by a rain of fire. Each destruction led to a new creation, each creation to eventual destruction. This cyclical view of history was not fatalistic, but preparatory. The Maya believed that by understanding the patterns of cosmic time, they could anticipate and potentially mitigate future catastrophes. Their astronomical observations, recorded in books called codices, tracked the movements of Venus with an accuracy that exceeded medieval European science. They believed that certain configurations of the planets were associated with war and disaster, and they timed their military campaigns and royal rituals to align with favorable astronomical conditions. The Maya also remembered specific catastrophes that had occurred within their own history. Inscriptions from the city of Tikal record a devastating war in 378 CE, when an army from the distant city of Teotihuacan, located more than 600 miles away in central Mexico, attacked and conquered Tikal. The existing royal dynasty was destroyed and replaced with rulers loyal to Teotihuacan. This event, known to archaeologists as the Entrada, was so traumatic that it reshaped Maya political culture for centuries afterward. But the greatest Maya catastrophe was still to come. Starting around 800 CE, the great cities of the Maya lowlands began to collapse. Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, Palenque, all the centers of classic Maya civilization, were abandoned within a few generations. The population declined by an estimated 90 to 95%. The jungle reclaimed the temples and palaces that had taken centuries to build. The causes of this collapse are still debated. Some scholars emphasize warfare, pointing to evidence of increased conflict in the final decades of the Classic period. Others emphasize environmental degradation, noting that the Maya had deforested much of their territory for agriculture and fuel, leading to soil erosion and declining agricultural productivity. Still others point to climate change, specifically a series of severe droughts, revealed by analysis of lake sediments and cave formations, which would have devastated a civilization that depended on seasonal rainfall for its water supply. Whatever the cause, the Maya did not simply disappear. The survivors of the collapse migrated to the highlands and the coastal regions, where they rebuilt their civilization in new forms. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, millions of Maya still lived in the region, speaking their ancient languages and maintaining their traditional practices. But they had lost much of the astronomical and mathematical knowledge of their ancestors. The codices that had preserved this knowledge were largely destroyed by Spanish missionaries, who considered them works of the devil. Only 4 Maya codices survive today, precious fragments of a vast library that once held the accumulated wisdom of 2 millennia. The Aztecs, who dominated central Mexico when the Spanish arrived, had inherited and elaborated the Mesoamerican catastrophe tradition. According to Aztec mythology, the current world was the 5th sun, preceded by 4 earlier suns that had been destroyed by jaguars, wind, fire, and water respectively. The current sun was destined to be destroyed by earthquakes, after which the universe would end. The Aztecs believed that this destruction could be postponed, but not prevented, by feeding the sun with human blood, which is why they practiced human sacrifice on a scale that horrified even other Mesoamerican peoples. The Aztec calendar stone, a massive carved disc that now resides in the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, depicts this cosmology in stone. At its center is the face of the sun god Tonatiuh, flanked by claws grasping human hearts. Surrounding this central image are symbols representing the 4 previous suns and the methods of their destruction. The outer ring contains glyphs representing the 20 days of the Aztec calendar. The entire stone is a teaching device designed to communicate the Aztec understanding of cosmic history to all who viewed it. The Aztecs also maintained historical records of catastrophes that had occurred within human memory. The Codex Telleriano-Ramensis, painted by Aztec scribes shortly after the Spanish conquest, records a series of disasters in the decades before the arrival of the Europeans. Famines in 1450 and 1454, caused by drought and frost that destroyed the maize crop, earthquakes that destroyed temples and killed many people, plagues that swept through the population. These disasters had weakened the Aztec state and contributed to the social tensions that the Spanish would later exploit. The Inca of Peru developed their own catastrophe traditions, though these are less well documented because the Inca did not have writing in the conventional sense. They recorded information using quipus, knotted strings that could encode numerical and possibly narrative information, but Spanish colonial authorities destroyed most quipus as pagan relics, and modern scholars have been unable to fully decipher those that survive. What we know of Inca catastrophe knowledge comes largely from Spanish chroniclers who recorded oral traditions in the decades after the conquest. According to these accounts, the Inca believed in a series of cosmic ages called Pachacuti, each of which ended in a world-destroying catastrophe. The word Pachacuti itself means world reversal or world transformation. It could refer to both the catastrophe that ended an age and the renewal that followed. The Inca also preserved memories of specific historical catastrophes. The Great Earthquake of 1400 CE, which destroyed much of the city of Cusco, was remembered as a turning point in Inca history. According to tradition, it was after this earthquake that the Inca began their rapid expansion, conquering the surrounding peoples and building the largest empire in pre-Columbian America. Some scholars speculate that the earthquake disrupted the existing political order, creating a power vacuum that the Inca were able to fill. The Inca responded to their catastrophe knowledge with impressive engineering. Their buildings were constructed using a technique called ashlar masonry, in which stones were cut to fit together so precisely that no mortar was needed. This construction method was highly resistant to earthquakes because it allowed the stones to shift and settle during a tremor without the walls collapsing. Many Inca structures have survived multiple major earthquakes, while the Spanish colonial buildings constructed on top of them have collapsed. The Inca also developed sophisticated agricultural systems designed to survive climate variations. Their terraced fields carved into the steep slopes of the Andes created multiple microclimates where different crops could be grown at different altitudes. If drought or frost destroyed crops at one altitude, those at other altitudes might survive. They maintained enormous storehouses filled with freeze-dried potatoes, dried meat, and other preserved foods that could feed the population for years during famines. They built roads and bridges that allowed rapid distribution of these stored resources to wherever they were needed. This redundancy and resilience was not accidental. It was the product of a civilization that had internalized its catastrophe knowledge and designed its institutions to survive the disasters it knew would inevitably come. The Inca understood that a